Hello and welcome back to How to Write Better Stories. I'm Joshua Milburn, and today we're going to talk about a little something I like to call a rising tide, or you've probably heard the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. I want to give you a recap of the other class that I teach because I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about all of the elements that I spend 4 weeks talking about over in the general writing class. But I want to give you a quick recap so you know where I'm coming from and then you know where we're going. If you've already taken the general writing class, most of this video you can actually skip because I'm going to give you some of my personal background. And we're going to go through some noteworthy discussion points for this class, sort of contrast and compare the stories class versus my general writing class. But first I want to do what most writers do, and that is talk about myself for a while. I want to tell you a little bit about my background so you can see if you can glean any words of wisdom or inspiration from that. It started when I was really young. I didn't really have an idea that I wanted to be a writer necessarily. And in fact, I grew up fairly poor in a suburb or a little town outside of Dayton, Ohio. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and growing up didn't have much money. And I realized in my late teens that if I wanted to be happy, I needed to make some money because I thought money would bring me happiness. And of course, I did what anyone who wants to make money would do legally. And I went and got a sales job. I went and got a job right out of high school that allowed me to work 6 or 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. And I realized even though I wasn't great at sales initially, I was able to work really hard and eventually get good at it. And by age 19, I was making $50,000 a year, but I was spending 65, and thought, well, maybe the money I thought that was going to make me happy isn't going to make me happy. Maybe I actually just need to make more money. And so I spent most of my 20s just climbing the corporate ladder and chasing this thing called happiness via this thing called success. But really, it was ostensible success because I was successful to many people. Many people said, you've got it all figured out, or you've got this impressive job title, or whatever. But I wasn't very happy doing what I was doing. In fact, by age 27, I had climbed the corporate ladder so high I was the youngest director in our company's 140-year history. I was managing 150 retail stores as director of operations. And I had everything that was supposed to make me successful. But what I realized was that I had spent most of my 20s doing something that didn't really align with three things for me. What I was doing didn't align with my interests. I wasn't interested in what I was doing. I worked in the telecom industry. And in fact, most of the time I was disinterested in a lot of what I was doing. It didn't interest me. It didn't get me going in the mornings. It wasn't in line with my values or my beliefs either. So it wasn't in line with my interests, my values, my beliefs. Those three things come up with me a lot now. It's very important. It took two really tragic events in my life to make me sort of start questioning everything. When I was 28, this is the end of 2009, two things happened within the span of 1 month that sort of changed everything for me. My mother died. She had just moved down to Florida and found out from Ohio, and she found out she had lung cancer. And then a few months later, she was gone. And in the same month, my marriage ended, my 8-year marriage. And I kind of looked around. My mother dies, my marriage ends, two of the people who were closest to me. And I look around, and I've got all this stuff, all these things that were supposed to make me happy. But those things weren't doing their job. Those things weren't making me happy at all. In fact, I'd spent all my time accumulating those things, and they actually did the opposite. They didn't bring me happiness. They brought me stress and anxiety and debt, massive crippling amounts of debt. I was making really good money, but spending even better money, living that American dream. And I had everything that I was supposed to want. The big house with more bedrooms than people. I had the luxury cars. I had literally the white picket fence. I had closets full of clothes. I had big screen TVs in several rooms, a basement full of stuff. But I wasn't doing anything that I was passionate about. I wasn't doing anything that was like I considered to be my mission in life, or anything that even aligned with my interests, values, and beliefs. Because see, since I was about 22, I had this desire to write, to create. It was around that time. You see, I wasn't born a natural writer. In fact, I read my first book when I was 21 years old. It was The Great Gatsby. And I read that, and then I started reading after that, and I got more and more addicted to this thing I call an exchange of consciousness. It's that communication between the author and the reader, and it breaks past all sort of time and space, because I can read something from, Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. I can read something by someone who's dead, and he's still communicating with me. It's very communicative and expressive in ways that other art forms, other mediums are not. And so literature, stories specifically, did something for me that no other art form, no other medium was able to do. Not movies, not even music, and certainly not the corporate job that I was working. It did something for me that made me want to have a hand in that, to be a part of the creation of something that was that communicative, that expressive, to have this engagement with a reader, and doing it in a way that was an exchange of consciousness. And so by age 22, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write. I wanted to write stories specifically, and I wanted to write fiction. And it was something that I was passionate about. And the problem was I didn't have the time, right? I was working that corporate job. I was very busy climbing the corporate ladder. I was working 70 to 80 hours a week, 362 days a year. Our stores were closed 3 days a year. So even when I was off, I was on call and would still get about a dozen phone calls a day and 100 or 200 emails. And so I was always working. Even when I wasn't working, I was working. Even when I was sleeping, I was dreaming or having nightmares about work. And it was unfortunate because I was so caught up in that lifestyle, that I didn't have time to write. Because writing is difficult. And so occasionally I would write when I got excited about it. In fact, I made this really big mistake in my early 20s. And what I learned, or what I thought I learned, was that excitement equaled passion. Well, I'm here to tell you today, over a decade later, that excitement does not equal passion. And so I learned this thing throughout my 20s and into my mid-20s, one of the most important lessons about passion. I have a friend now who just recently wrote a book about this concept. His name's Cal Newport, and he wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And in that book, the premise, one of the premises, is that passion is not followed. Follow your passion is basically shitty advice. And we hear it all the time now, right? It's promulgated on blogs and on the internet and self-help books and at conventions and by well-meaning people who tell you to follow your passion. Well, there's a couple problems there. I think that advice presupposes that you have a pre-existing passion, as if any of us were born to be a writer or an artist or a DJ or a musician or an input accountant or a carpenter or an upholsterer. None of us have that innate passion that we're born with. The truth is that I could be passionate about dozens of things, maybe even hundreds of things, but they have to align with three things. So anything that I could be passionate about has to align with my interests, my values, and my beliefs. And what I was doing in the corporate world, while it was exciting from time to time, because I had this lifestyle that pretended to be successful, right? It was purportedly successful. Uh, it wasn't actually successful because ultimately my measurement of success now is, am I happy? Am I growing? And am I contributing? Those three things: happy, growth, contribution. That's it. If I'm doing that, then I know that I'm successful. It's not about how shiny my car is or what my bank account looks like, because I believe you can make a ton of money and be utterly miserable. And that's not what success looks like to me. In fact, in the corporate world, I looked around and saw all these guys who were above me, these guys who I aspired to be. And they were people I thought were successful. And I realized, 20 years from now, I could be just like them. I could be just as miserable as them because, unfortunately, they were miserable. And it's not like they were bad guys. Many of them were great guys, but they had never done anything that they were completely passionate about. And so this advice of follow your passion, I also believe that it's shitty advice because it presupposes that you have a passion, and then it also presupposes that you're supposed to just follow this one thing and it'll be great. But I found out that it doesn't actually work that way. I find that instead of following your passion, you should cultivate your passion. And I think there is a huge distinction between the two. And the most important lesson I learned about ultimately cultivating my passion was this thing I call the payoff of drudgery. And what I mean by that is throughout my early 20s and into my mid 20s, every time I got excited about something I wanted to write, maybe it'd be early in the morning or I wake up from a dream or at night, I'd get excited about an idea and I've got this great story idea, this novel idea, I want to do it, but over time my excitement would wane or my attention would go somewhere else. And so I'd write for a day or 2 days or maybe even a week and 3 days. But eventually that excitement waned because I'd get to a point where it was difficult. It was hard. Writing is hard. You realize that you're taking this class now because the writing is hard and you want to be able to get better at it. Well, I would stop because who wants to do something that's hard when there's so many easy things that you can do instead? If you check an email is easy. That lets someone else dictate your to-do list. Hell, going to work is easy in most cases because you have a boss who's telling you what to do. And being told what to do is easy. It's dictating your to-do list. It's very responsive instead of being proactive. It's reactive. And so writing was something that was creating. It was very proactive. And but when it got difficult, I would move to checking my email or watching TV or doing something that was fundamentally passive because those things were much easier for me. The problem is that I realized that the real payoff never came from those passive tasks. The real payoff came from actually sitting down and getting through the difficult parts, getting through the hard parts. Because when I started writing, about 80% of the time, it actually ended up being very hard for me to write. But the other 20% of the time, where I broke through those hard spells, is where all the reward was. That's where all the payoff was in that extra 20%. The excitement, the real excitement came from that, not the initial idea of excitement, but the payoff, the reward, the feeling of accomplishment, the feeling of creation came after the drudgery. And so that 80% over time became 70%, became 60%. Eventually, it got down to about 50%, where there were good days and there were bad days. There were days where I had to just wade through the drudgery, and there were days where there was just this immense payoff. And that took time of sitting in the chair. In fact, some of the best advice I ever got was from a guy named Donald Ray Pollock, and we're actually going to review one of his novels during our 4th week. And I took him out to lunch. He has a very compelling story. He left the factory at age 50 to write fiction. He said he'd give himself 5 years to write fiction, and if it didn't work, then he could at least set it aside and say he gave it his all. Well, he was fortunate enough to be very successful and has published two very successful books at this point. He's a very talented fiction author from southeastern Ohio, which is sort of the other side of the state from where I grew up. But I took him out to lunch, and he said, the best advice I can give you is 4 words. And I always tell students in my general writing class, if you get one thing from that class, I hope you get 100 things from the class. If you get one thing, these 4 words made all the difference in my writing life. He said, the best advice I can give you is sit in the chair. Those 4 words, sit in the chair. If you can do that every day, don't worry about page count or word count or whatever. Don't worry about the distractions in your life either. Get those out of the way. If you can sit down in the chair distraction-free every day, and that's what I ask my general writing students to do. I ask them to sit in the chair an hour a day for the entire month. I personally write 3 hours a day. That's what works for me. And sometimes it's more than that, especially when it's going well. When it's going well, you don't even have to look up and look at the clock because time just passes you by so quickly. But even on those bad days, the stuff in those bad days pulls forward to the good days. And many of those bad days are just phenomenally good after the fact. Because you get to that payoff and you get to look back in your rear view and you see that the bad days were actually a lot more beautiful than you thought. Because I don't believe in this thing called writer's block. I don't think other professions tend to have this concept. There's no carpenter that has carpenter's block. There's no input accountant who has accounting block. It's something that we've made up so we can go do something else passive. I believe sometimes, it gets hard. We get stuck on things. But that's anything we do in life. It's just about actually getting past wherever you're stuck, getting through that bottleneck to be able to get to the other side. Because it seems to me that writing is one of those few professions where people think that they can actually just obtain the knowledge via osmosis. I think the good news is we're all writers. We all write emails and text messages and everything else. But what differentiates a professional writer from an amateur is the work, sitting down and actually doing the work all the time. And we'll get to that. I'm going to talk to you about some other techniques there as well. But in my late 20s then, what I started to do was I started to sit in the chair every day. By age 26, 27, I was getting up early for work. In fact, I would spend an hour in the mornings. I would wake up at 4:45 each morning and write until 5:45 because, you see, I didn't have the extra time throughout the day. So I sacrificed an hour of sleep in order to get better at my craft. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that you sacrifice an hour of sleep, but I believe that quite often we pay lip service to our priorities. We say our priorities are one thing. We'll say that my health is a priority, or that my writing habit is my priority, or spending time with my family is a priority. And that may be so. I mean, that may be your intention. But I think our real priorities are however we spend our day. A lot of people will say, but I don't have the time to write, or I don't have the time to write every day, or I don't have the time to exercise, or I don't have the time to do whatever. And I always have to call bullshit on that because time is the one resource that we all have the same exact amount of. We all have the same 24 hours in a day. How we choose to use those 24 hours is up to us. Now, I realize that we all have different obligations. We all have come from different circumstances. But ultimately, how we spend our 24 hours in the day, those are our real priorities. Everything else is lip service. So I had to change my priorities and make writing a real priority in my late 20s. And guess what? When I started sitting in the chair every day, when I started doing the work, I got good at it. It took some time because I didn't know how to write. I didn't have an education. I didn't go to college for writing. I'd never taken a writing course or class. And I didn't even take something like this, which would have really helped me understanding the recipe. because I don't have the burden of going through teacher training. I was in the corporate world for a dozen years, and I learned how to get results from people in a very attenuated period of time because I don't have to follow the same rules that a university is going to follow, or I don't have to follow the same rules that are required by a particular state in order to fulfill an education requirement. That's silly to me. I'm a business person and I'm a writer. I know what works for me, and I know how to show you my recipe and help you by getting my recipe to work for you as well. So that is my story. I spent the next few years in the corporate world. Eventually, I got to a point where I was no longer satisfied with what I was doing with my life there. And I planned to leave to write fiction. And I had been working on a novel for a while called As a Decade Fades, which is now published. But I was just going to see how I could scrape by outside of the corporate world. I knew that if I got even a part-time job and it allowed me to write, I would be much happier. And the time for me to exit actually came because I had spent 2 years really paying off my debt, what I like to call the ramen noodles meal plan, because I went back to slashed all my expenses, spent 2 years paying off tens of thousands of dollars of debt, and paid off the vast majority of it, and got to a point in my company where they came to me and asked me to lay off 42 people. We were doing some right sizing, as they called it. And it was a very unfortunate time. I had been through it before. They wanted me to close 8 stores and get rid of 42 employees. And I had been through it, but on much smaller levels. We'd close a store here and there, move some people around, terminated people. I mean, I'd fired dozens of people over the years. But this was all at once, and a light bulb sort of went off for me. And they said, you've got 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. You've got 2 weeks to put together a plan and then present it to us and let us know which 8 stores we're going to close and what 42 employees we're going to get rid of. And it took me 2 days to put together the plan, just 2 days. And I came back to my boss and handed it in, and my name was the first name on the list. And he thought it was a joke. He thought that, well, wait a minute, you are, this young guy, you're not even 30 yet. I was just turning 30. And you're going to leave all of this behind? And people thought I was crazy. And they said, well, what are you going to do? They were certain I was going to go work for a competitor because that's what they would do in my situation. And I had this job that a lot of people aspired toward. I just got it 10, 15 years earlier than a lot of people at my company who are at a similar level. And so they asked me what I was going to do, and I said, well, no, I'm just going to write. I'm going to go write fiction and just see what can happen. I have enough money to live for 2 or 3 months. I want to finish up this book. If I need to get a part-time job, that's great. And I've really simplified my life, and so I don't need as much income anymore. And right around the same time, actually 4 days later, my best friend and I started a website called The Minimalists, theminimalists.com. And just sort of documented our journey, because around the same time, Ryan was really simplifying his life as well. And he had done this thing called a packing party, where he packed up everything in his huge condo just to see what he was going to use. And he unpacked things only as he needed them for the next 21 days. And during those 21 days, after those 21 days rather, he still had about 80% of his stuff still boxed up. And he started to realize the same thing that I realized, that, wow, all of these things that were supposed to make me happy aren't making me happy. And so I'm working my ass off to get these things that are supposed to make me happy that aren't making me happy. So I'm working my ass off to not be happy. And we started this website together and documented our journey separately, and we called it The Minimalists, because we were minimizing our lives, and we'd been reading about this thing called minimalism. And to our surprise, I was really ignorant to the whole nonfiction genre. I'd written stories, short stories, and a couple cracks at different novels and narrative stuff, but that's the only stuff I'd written. I was really ignorant to the whole nonfiction genre. But I figured I'd give it a shot if someone else could find value. Because what I realized and what Ryan realized is that we weren't crazy. Maybe this lifestyle wouldn't resonate with everyone, but our story would resonate with enough people that, maybe, a few dozen or a few hundred people could find value in it in the long run. And that'd be great. Here's a way for us to document it. It's pretty easy to start a website. In fact, we didn't even know it was called a blog at the time. We didn't know what a blog was. And so when we started the website, we had 52 people show up the first month. And I remember being so excited that 52 people showed up because I had never had that many people read my stuff before. You see, the only people who read my stuff were people who said no to me throughout my 20s, because I'd sent off manuscripts and stories and all this other stuff, and I'd always gotten rejection letters back from agents and publishers and literary magazines, and rightfully so for a lot of the stuff. A lot of the stuff wasn't great, but I grew over time by doing that. And so 52 people reading my stuff was so exciting. Well, over the course of a few months, 52 people turned into 5,000. That turned into 50,000. And about 9 months in, it turned into about 100,000 people were showing up every single month to read our stuff. And now it's over 2 million people who show up a year. And it keeps growing and growing and growing. And this is just a few years later. This is less than 3 years after we started the site that I'm recording this right now. And I got really fortunate that the writing piece took off, the nonfiction piece, and people were asking us to write a book, and so we went and wrote a book. And I've been fortunate enough to make a living now off of publishing books. And I'll talk to you a bit about that, but I cover that a lot more in my other class as well. So that's my story. I left the corporate world right as I was turning age 30 and started focusing on what I was passionate about, what I had cultivated into my passion, which for me was writing. And there's also this thing I call transference, because I was really good at writing stories, at writing fiction, and I learned that I could take that skill and pair it with something else I was good with, which for me was adding value to other people's lives. In the corporate world, I was very good at coaching and mentoring and finding ways to help people grow, is ultimately what it was about, was helping other people grow. So I could take that ability for writing stories, the writing piece specifically, and I could take the piece where I was really good at helping people grow. And I could take those two skills and transfer them into something else, and that's where this whole nonfiction thing came from. And then from there, other things happen. I teach this class now, and I've met so many amazing people. I've gone on several book tours at this point, dozens of cities, with great, amazing crowds who show up now. And our message continues to get out. But ultimately, it's because I've found ways to add value to other people's lives. So that is my story. In my general writing class, which I'd like to talk to you about just for a second here, I cover that a lot more. In fact, the fourth week itself is focused on publishing. How do we focus on, I call it neopub, the new ways of publishing? Because before, there was just this traditional route. And there's still nothing wrong with that traditional route. If you want to get signed by, get an agent, get a publisher, that's great. You're welcome to do that. But for the longest time, that was the route. Now, the good news is that's a route. But there are so many other routes for you to take as well. In fact, I think now is the most exciting time in history to be a writer, because you have all of these other avenues. I've done everything completely independently, and that's been great. Now I have traditional publishing offers all the time. In fact, one of my books is traditionally published, and that's, like I said, one route. But by establishing my own clout on my own and doing it myself, not only have I learned a lot, but I'm not beholden to any particular set of gatekeepers. And you don't have to be either. And that's one of the things that I teach in my other class. A few other things that we cover in the general writing class we're not going to cover here. I just want to go over those with you really quick. One is I talk about your writing habit in detail. I spend that whole first week actually helping you establish a writing habit. Here's what I'll say to you. If you're writing every day already, great. Good for you. You're in the top 10%. But what I found is most people aren't willing to sit down and actually write every day. And so what I do is I find ways to help you write every single day. We have some mechanisms in place in that class to help hold you accountable, help you hold yourself accountable, and ultimately cultivate that daily writing into your passion. I also talk about two things called what I call jam session writing and panning for gold. Basically, I give you some techniques that are different from any technique that you're used to using right now that I've learned that have worked incredibly well for me in the past. Jam session writing, which is many people may even call it stream of consciousness, but it is different. I make some pretty uh, distinct distinctions between jam session writing and the stream of consciousness writing. And then I think most importantly in that process, besides the habits, is I show you how to rewrite. Because I think good writing is rewriting. There's that old quote, style is the best words in the best places. And that's what I show you how to do. I show you how to make your writing beautiful and concise and expressive, how to communicate what you're trying to communicate, how to use specific techniques to add variety to your writing. And so I go through a lot of those techniques in that third week of that course, right before we talk about publishing. So that class, the general writing class, is a lot more writing intensive than this class is. This class is a lot more reading intensive and study intensive, because what we're doing is we're studying the aspects of good stories, of what makes a great story. What exactly is narrative? What are we trying to do with that? So this is a lot more ruminative, whereas the other one is a lot more hands-on, not nose to the grindstone, getting your hands dirty kind of thing. I think both classes complement each other very well. In fact, the most overlap is in this video right here. So I try not to have a ton of overlap between the two classes. It's inevitable. We're talking about writing in both classes, but both classes are appreciably different. That class is focused on getting you to write better. This one is helping you write better stories. That's all I have for you during this video. In our next video, I'm going to talk to you about fiction versus narrative nonfiction, how they're similar and how they're different. Until then, I will see you in the community. Welcome aboard. I'm looking forward to getting started. Thank you.